students and checking in on where people are with that, because in order to be have strong learning, it's not just about the opportunity to learn, right? You have to be engaged in the learning process, and certainly mental or emotional things can get in the way of that. So we have to start with that. Two is being really sympathetic that people were abruptly changing to a remote learning environment. So it's not something that very many students had preparation for, experience in, so they're getting used to it. And the third, I would say, on the long term is that to trust your teachers and educators that we know how to accelerate students when they need to be accelerated. And there will be a time and place to do that. Right now, except for maybe a few extenuating circumstances, it's probably going to be less effective in this environment right now, and that it may be more advisable to figure out how you can do some things that you wouldn't do in school. Joys of discovery, long-term projects, simple things to discover passions, be very hands-on with things. So those are some of the things I would think of for parents. Allison, anything that you would add for as a parent and a researcher? What does research tell you to do as a mom? We won't ask you if you actually do it.
No, you can. So one thing that we know is how important motivation is, and we've moved over the last decade from between models of motivation. So we used to think in terms of language learning, the old way was to think it's intrinsic and extrinsic, or internal and external. So an internal motivation would be, I would like to learn the language so I can communicate with my grandparents because they speak it and I don't. And an external reason would be, I need to learn this language because I need to pass this particular test so I can get a good score so I can get into college. These days, what we're realizing is that motivation fluctuates. It's different, and it fluctuates over time and depending on what you're doing and who you're speaking to. It's much more modulated. It's much more of a continuum. So one of the things that we know in these current circumstances is that we as parents should be doing as much as we can to keep our children motivated. Now, I can tell you what the research and best practices suggest. They suggest things like, with language, try to create a linguistic landscape for your children. So I'm sure you've read a million times, try to have them sit down and do their work, their schoolwork at a particular time that's similar every day. Try to have a comfortable, quiet environment for them where they've got their laptop, they know this is their time to sit and do their work. With the linguistic landscape, we mean print out some things related to that culture that are meaningful to you and your child. Get suggestions from your teachers, look at the web. Try to create an atmosphere that is motivating. So I can say things like that, but I also know from my own children, you know, I can say to them, okay, guys, let's work on the linguistic landscape today. And my son says, I don't think so. I'd like to work on, what's that awful thing? Fortnite. And I'm thinking, oh, well, perhaps Fortnite comes in a different language and we can work on, you know, Battle Royale. What's the word royale mean in a different language? So I can say in general that as motivating as we can be, whether that is, okay, let's look in the contents of the freezer and cook food that belongs to the culture of the language we're learning. And then we're going to try, even when the parents, one or both of them, don't speak the language, we're going to try and make the recipe or eat the food, or we're going to do something related to the language. Just try and do one thing a day, just one thing a day to keep the kids going. And the other thing I would say as an educator is choose your battles, because we all know this is stressful for everybody, and it just isn't worth it to force them to speak, you know, to force them to produce or listen when they actively absolutely don't want to. Try and keep some of the fun and interest going if we can.
Yeah, and that's transferable across other academic domains. David, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think the other thing is, you know, we've talked a little bit about don't be afraid of the limitations of technology. I think that technology also provides us for something that really, really plays into this, which is this idea of a learning network. So that it's not just the parent trying to drag a kid out of bed and get them to sort of watch a Zoom lecture or do a problem set. But the idea is that technology does allow us to connect in a variety of different ways. And as Jeff pointed out, I think that there's some joyous sort of things that are just good fun to do. Kind of virtual field trips and where you could get several kids together and take them on kind of some kind of virtual field trip or scavenger hunt. But the idea of building that fabric or network really allows for multiple touch points to check in, to coach, to give peer feedback, and all those things, I don't think you have to make a giant deal about it, but just creating those opportunities in a periodic way allows, I think, for a much richer and more sustainable learning environment than the sort of some kind of drudgery model where it says, now I have to get online and go do this.
And should we move to some of the questions that are starting to come in? Is that all right with everybody? So one of the first questions is one of the things, David, we wanted to talk about anyway. So it's kind of a nice transition. It's can you talk a little bit about the merits and downfalls of asynchronous versus synchronous learning, and if we have any recommendations about amount of the time that we should be thinking about synchronous?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting when at the 30,000 foot level, everyone sort of on this webinar understands that school is way more than just a collection of classroom hours. It is way more, and it almost, that's the least important part of how it all sort of fits together, with all the interchange and all the feedback and all the ancillary things and the conversations that happen in the hall, or the play that happens. So in the theater, or the practice for something, but all of those things, I think, happen in a more ad hoc kind of way, where to blend and to say, if it matters what time it is, like, hey, it's a fun conversation for us all to get together. That doesn't really work asynchronously. But kind of watching a particular film and then coming back together at a certain time, well, we can watch that film at 2 o'clock or 4 o'clock or 8 o'clock. But what's really important is we all committed to get together at 10 o'clock to talk about it. So the synchronous part is what we're going to do to interact with one another, where the asynchronous part can be the stuff in preparation for those meaningful and purposeful synchronous experiences. That makes sense, Jeff?
Yeah, Allison, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I did. I love how the general is matching and mapping onto the linguistic. So for languages, what we say is that they're both important and they both have a critical role to play. So I'm going to give you an example of why asynchronous learning tools work. So part of learning a language is hearing the sounds of the language, understanding what they mean, and being able to produce them as a native speaker. If I mispronounce something in a language in the classroom, my teacher might correct me once. She might correct me very directly and explicitly and say, no, you say it like this, and model it. Or she might correct it implicitly by saying I don't understand, and then I have to try again. But what a piece of software or an app can do is get me to pronounce it 51 times, show me a bar of how close I am to a native speaker, give me a little bit of, haptic or other kinds of bling feedback when I get it right, and go to me when I get it wrong. It's no stress. I can do it as many times as I want. The software is a teacher. It doesn't get bored. It doesn't get, offended. So however many times I want to, I can practice sounds, listening, understanding, recognition using speech recognition technology. But what I can't get from that is meaning, authentic interaction and communication of using it. That's what I get from the synchronous part of it. So for language, both are important, both have their place, and we can do both of them well with distance education. So I'll just add to what David said there.
What I was going to add to what David said was that I think that one of the things that really matters in the sort of the balance between synchronous and asynchronous is just lots of variety. I've been in contact with two schools recently, one which organizes its day, and this is a school, it's a K through 8 school. It organizes its day, bringing the kids all together as a homeroom group at the start of the day and the end of the day, has synchronous periods during the day when the kids are actually working together on projects, but also has totally asynchronous kinds of experiences going on. The kids in that school seem to be very, very happy with that, and the parents report they're making good progress. Another school, caught by surprise as everybody was with this, is basically just sat their teachers down, and the kids are getting 4 or 5 hours of Zoom conversations a day. They're bored out of their minds. You can't concentrate on Zoom for that long and have a meaningful experience. So the lack of variety there is proving difficult. And I think you have to think about synchronous and asynchronous as two very positive ways of learning and balance them, mix them up a little bit so that the kids remain engaged.
Yeah, we're seeing quite a lot of things appear in the popular press with questions like, why is Zoom so exhausting? And then cognitive psychologists and linguists are coming in and explaining why. And there are great reasons why. So to give just a couple, one is that as human beings, we're not cognitively adapted to stare into each other's faces when we don't know each other that well, right? And as linguists, we're adapted to pick up on subtle cues to know when it's our turn to speak and when somebody's talking too long. And we're adapted to figure those things out. And so both of those things are taking us more time and they're making us more tired. So when people say an hour and a half in a class of Zoom is way more tiring than a full day face to face, yes, that's why. And that's why also for many of us, if you call someone on the phone, it's kind of an intimate thing. Their voice is in your ear, you hear them. You can also kind of look at your nails, drink a cup of tea. You can zone off on the times you want to zone off, where you can't on Zoom, which is why including for teachers, including things like podcasts for children to just listen to while they're doing the dishes or taking a walk, what we need to do is exactly what David and Ty have said and mix it up. With online education, we need to make sure we're doing it in multiple different modes, not always one. I feel sorry for those kids and those teachers doing 4 hours of Zoom.
Well, I think Ty and Jeff both know that this exhausts me because I don't like to sit still. And so the idea, and it's not natural. It's certainly not natural for a teacher to sort of sit. So we spent 50 years trying to get the teacher to stand up and get away from their desk. Yes. And now we said, sit down back behind your desk, right? Stand still. Don't move. Don't do this.
Yeah. We're suddenly competitive
to do that.
So we have a question from I think a teacher, school leader from Massachusetts who is giving an example and asking a question that they're noticing that the students who struggled in class face-to-face classrooms are also struggling online or maybe more. And they're worried about gaps growing wider and wider during this time. What advice might you have for working particularly with struggling students?
Shall I take a crack at that?
Sure.
Because in a sense that contradicts a little bit of the research that I was mentioning earlier, and that there's certain students who struggle in class and are finding online the privacy of it, the ability to work asynchronously, the safety of doing it at home, and all of those things enables deeper concentration. I could also imagine, and I suspect that's what this school person is describing, that there are other kinds of challenges that people have in their learning that really need the human interaction of the classroom. And probably what they may need is that sensitive teacher who can tell by their body language, by the question they ask, by all the cues that you develop when you're in charge of a group of students, when that child is having difficulty, and provide some support and help. So I think my recommendation here would be to experiment they're not going to be able to create a real classroom and a real teacher under these current conditions, but they can create different kinds of spaces for the child to work with. And maybe that child needs 20 minutes a day of one-on-one tutoring with an instructor. Maybe there is a particular kind of cognitive challenge that child just doesn't get, and it's time for that child to take a vacation on it till we all get back to school together. The world won't end if that's the solution. So, yeah, my response would be experiment.
Yeah, I think Ty, I think the really sound advice is kind of, as you said, maybe experiment with a few things that you're building on the first principles of intervention. If you don't see those working as you're experimenting, bank on the long arc of learning. Learning actually happens over a long arc. There's a beginning, middle, and end to the circumstances that we are in now. We don't know where we are on that continuum with certainty, but we know that there will be an end, and that we may need to address certain learning challenges face to face, because we may not have all the tools developed right now, or maybe not have all the resources. So as I started out, different schools are in very different situations, from having what their mission is, so what it is that they're trying to really accomplish, what their pedagogical approach is, so what are people steeped in, and then what resources do they have, both online and offline resources.
So Jeff, I have another sort of comment there, which is it pairs with, in one sense, you have to look at sort of this long arc education, but the other thing is, I think you can shorten the cycle of checkpoints in this sort of period of time, right? So if you have a concern about a particular student or group of students, the idea would be to rein in the guardrails a little bit, so that you don't say, hey, I'm going to give you something on Monday and we'll check and see where you get to on Friday. You might want to say, we'll check and see where you get to at 12 o'clock. So the idea is that you shorten up those cycles of feedback, and at least in the short term, you can shorten up it and then sort of stretch the interval over time. But I think if I was having challenges, especially with motivation, I would try to shorten the interval at first, till I was seeing the behaviors in a regular way, and then try to stretch the interval farther.
Yep. All right, let's get a couple of rapid.
Should I just add a little bit to that?
Sure, and then we'll go rapid fire questions.
Okay, very quick. So first of all, I would say thanks to the teacher in Massachusetts who noticed this, right? Because the first thing about education is noticing what's going on with every child in your classroom. I might see this as an opportunity for differentiation, and try to make lemons out of lemonade. So the child was struggling already in face-to-face classroom instruction, and the teacher presumably hadn't found a real fix for that. So maybe moving online gives you more opportunities to try more different things. So my approach might be to do a kind of needs analysis with this child, and to see what it is that the child, how do they think they learn? Do they like listening? Do they like reading? Do they like offline? Do they like online? And then, as David suggests, shorten the cycle a bit so that you test things with them. You can do much more testing on a one-to-one online than you can in a classroom environment. That was my quick and dirty answer. Okay, let's go.
No, that's great. So there's a question, and I'll address this real quick. Is there any difference between underserved students and underserved communities when defining first principles? And I think the whole idea of first principles is to be able to apply them in any and all settings. And so I think instead of us as educators comparing what we're doing in our classrooms, because as I said, unless you have same mission, same pedagogical approach, same resources, it may or may not be applicable. But the first principles of one, that you know and believe that online learning can be as good or better than face-to-face, is a good starting point. So that's your own motivation as a leader, as a teacher. The second is that not all online is created equal is very important, because you want to think about what are the specific ways you need to design things for online particularly paying attention to learning and not replicating the physical classroom only, or replacing teaching. That's another common mistake. So I think really breaking down and saying, what do we have to design specifically to take advantage of the digital? And then the third is to say, with that motivation and engagement, including parents plays an outside role, you may be wanting to spend some more time with family calls or student calls and things like that in order to make sure you have those check-ins. So those things are really regardless of socioeconomic, where you are in the world. That's really the idea behind first principles. They're applicable to everybody. All right, Allison, you mentioned, this is a very specific question. It's a good one though. Some online learning has gotten a bad name, particularly if you take like MOOCs, right, where the dropout rate and completion rate is very high. So the question here is, when you are looking at some of the studies that are showing no significant difference phenomenon, are they including only those who complete or including those who drop out as well?
Oh, that's a great question. I love design questions.
Yeah, I know. I knew you would love this one.
Yeah, there are not MOOCs for language learning, as far as I'm aware. And in the meta-analyses, so there's two. If this person who asked this question wants to email me afterwards, I'm happy to send them the meta-analyses. The meta-analytic research that I'm aware of has only looked at what's so-called successful. So when people do drop out, that wouldn't be considered as a criteria, as an inversion criteria, an inclusion criteria for the study. So the person is quite right at what they're getting at, which is that there could be a bunch of different online situations that people haven't been successful at. And the person's probably thinking of some companies, some of the bigger companies, Rosetta Stone and other companies like that, will release studies that show success. But success is judged as completing certain levels of things. And I don't just mean to single out Rosetta Stone, most of them do. But what happens, it's like gym membership. Can you say a gym membership does not work if you don't go to the gym, right? You can only say you don't know if it would work, right? You can't say it didn't work. So, or at least so the thinking goes. But it's a good point, and we could be underreporting what isn't working.
Yeah, but most of the research, and this research has been around for 40 plus years now, and is controlled for those things. So even taking some of that into account, online learning has shown to have no significant difference.
So the studies I'm thinking of haven't been 40 years ago, I should clarify.
Sure.
They're about 20 years ago. And they're about language learning in particular.
Language.
And what they're showing is no differences between face-to-face or online, or slight advantages for online. And then to complicate it even further, those studies are sort of broken down a bit into whether we're talking about proficiency improvement, specific linguistic form improvement, when we mean online, whether we're talking about synchronous or asynchronous. So I have oversimplified it, but I've got two neat quotes, which I can send anyone who's interested, from the meta-analytic research, which say slight advantage, better, or no disadvantage. What I think is important to point out is I'm not aware of studies that show tangible really specific differences where classrooms are better than online environments, even though as teachers we would like to think they are.
Yeah, well, we certainly believe that at Avenues. As Ty knows, a student who graduates from Avenues online gets the same degree as go to New York, Sao Paulo, Shenzhen, and elsewhere. So,
well, my kids are in Avenues online. So
I know.
Yeah.
So, Allison, this is a question from somebody who is multilingual and saying, does your research on learning a second language, which we say, does that apply to third, fourth, or more?
I love this question. It does. So one of the things we know, and one of the things we flirted with a little while with Avenues Online was, why don't we get people to do a language passport that includes children learning 6 different languages? Because one thing we know is that third language acquisition, depending on the language, can bootstrap on second language acquisition. So if you're learning a typologically quite similar language to the second, so French from Spanish, it'll be a little bit faster and a little bit easier. However, we also know that learning languages which are very typologically different from the first language convey particular benefits in terms of knowing a second language well. So if you, for example, speak English and French and then learn Arabic or Mandarin, together with a whole different writing script, many of the benefits, the cognitive advantages, which include being better able to filter out distracting information. Imagine what a bonus that is for today's children. Things like being a little bit quicker at certain processing tasks, social advantages like understanding that different means different, not better, not worse, it just means different in terms of social, plus advantages where we know that people making business decisions in their second languages are slowed down a little bit and often make more sensible, logical decisions because they're not making them from their gut as they do with their first language. Many of these advantages are magnified when the second or third language is typologically different from the first language. Or the second language. So it's kind of a complicated answer, but yes, the research generally does apply to third, fourth, fifth language acquisition. And I'll just finish by saying, only in a country like the United States do we view multilingualism as something special, unique, different, and slightly scary. If we teach our children 3 languages, does that mean that they're going to be behind their age-matched peers in terms of literacy and numeracy? No, it doesn't. But they don't worry about these things in other countries of the world. Think of Belgium, think of Switzerland, think of Aboriginal Australia. It's just normal to be multilingual there. But in the United States, it's weird. So thank you for that question. Loved it. Sorry to answer so quickly.
Weird in a good way, you mean?
I do. I mean, okay, just one.
We're trying to change that conversation, Allison.
Indeed. So this is the gift that we're giving our children when we educate them bilingually. People who speak more than one language very well, fluently, are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and other cognitive disorders on average 4 years later than monolinguals, right? That's because the bilinguals, the multilinguals, and the people who speak one language very well, more than one language very well, have adapted different ways of dealing with things like the damage that Alzheimer's causes in the brain. So it's not that they develop it later, they develop it. Brain studies have shown they develop it at about the same age. It's that it's not diagnosed for 4 years because the person and people around them don't notice, because bilinguals are more cognitively flexible. That's an amazing advantage. So yeah, we're trying to change it so that in this country, knowing a second language well becomes as natural as being good at math or great at art.
Yeah, many benefits. Ty, question for you. With teachers in the cocoon, using David's metaphor, this organization's previously worked to develop teachers in a classroom setting. And it sounds like they probably have like a number of instructional coaches, things like that. How would you encourage them to coach and develop teachers in this new world?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And And it's a question that I think we all ought to realize, where everybody who's in education at this point is discovering the answer to that question as we go along. We don't have a great deal of research practice there that we can rely on. But one of the things that I think is especially helpful, the way that you coach teachers in a physical classroom is by going and visiting the class. And if you're experienced at that, you bring a protocol with you, or you have internalized the protocol and you know what you're looking for. And you, after a period of observation, begin to realize what the teacher's strengths are and the areas where they could use some coaching and help. And then you provide that coaching and help, and there's a whole variety of methodologies to do that. One of the ones that I happen to like the best myself is to actually get the teacher to videotape a class and then sit down with them. And just like Bill Belichick does after a Patriots game, you go to the videotape and you find out what actually happened. Nobody, when they're teaching a class, can remember all the detail of what's going on. Well, online education gives us the opportunity to have a video record of the interactions that we're having with our students. And I would encourage schools that do have coaches or have administrators that are assigned to that particular role to explore what they can do with whatever systems they're using. What we're saying right now is, as I understand it, being recorded and videotaped, and anything that you do on Zoom or Skype or any of those platforms will allow you to do that as well. So I think there's actually very rich data out there that can be used. One of the things that I believe in strongly, however, is that administrators never want to have a relationship with their teachers where the teachers think they're being spied upon. So that the question of what video gets looked at really should lie in the hands of the teacher, not the administrator. And when the teacher perceives that there was a class that either went particularly well or didn't go well, that's the time for them to bring it to the coach and say, help me out with this, or help me get better at doing what just happened here. But I think we've got rich data to work with in this new format.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. And since my favorite psychologist is part of this meeting, I know he'll agree that one of the other things that you can do is to have self-identified goals. So whether it be through video or something else, I think one of the biggest coaching shifts that could be made at this time is when you're having a meeting with a teacher one-on-one, ask them what they want to learn, what do they want to work on getting better, and then brainstorm some of those things and hold accountability. So I think that we know from psychology from a long period of time that self-identified goals tend to be accomplished more than those imposed on by somebody else. So go ahead, David. Since you are my favorite psychologist, yes.
Well, I also think in this period especially, right, I think we come back to, do you think or do you know? And that sort of sounds like a pretty trite saying, but I think it comes down to this idea of evidence. And as we shape these new learning environments and look to give feedback to one another, the idea is to look for those definable behaviors and their learning behaviors, right? So I think it'd be very easy for us to start to say, let me critique the teacher. That's a leap too far, perhaps, right? But the idea would be to say, if I have a set of behavioral goals for the learner, now let me look at those goals. Let me look at those behaviors and say, do the behaviors align with the goals? And to start to build that feedback system around the data, again, versus somehow assessing the presentation.
Yep. So piling on the assessment, moving over to the student assessment side, the couple questions asking about, particularly in this setting, any advice on assessment during online. David, do you want to start? And then maybe Allison weigh in as well?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll start by saying I think this idea of revision and refinement, which is really tough in sort of, it's like pulling teeth sometimes with students. This idea that says, I want to turn something in and I want to move on. Like, and give me the grade that I'm going to get, and I'll just move on to the next thing. The idea of trying to build in some period of reflection and refinement based on feedback, I think, is a really excellent piece. And it sort of ties into the concept of formative assessments. But the idea here is to pull sort of these data that allow people to act and react and refine, not just sort of score and move on.
Yeah, if there's ever a better time to remember that while all tests are assessment, all assessments are not tests. No. So I'm sure Allison is going to talk a little bit about this in tasks and looking at projects and things like that, of what kind of artifacts you can look at. So
I don't even need to say it. You already did.
I didn't want to get. I don't want to guess your answer. I'm a good student, no, Allison. Go ahead.
That's exactly it. With language, what we know is that the best way to assess language is in an ongoing way, not through summative and formative assessments. Really, all, whatever they are, all need to be based on authentic language tasks. And one of the things that Ty just mentioned is something that we pay attention to very much in Avenues Online. So we use the technology. So we have a capstone task at the end of the week, and the task is based on building and putting together everything that the kids have been doing through the week. And so assessment in an online environment consists of consolidation and making let me give a specific example, because I think it's easier to see that. If the kids have been engaged in using the language, for example, through a one-to-one in a video, through doing a project where they filled out forms or done or built up journal entries, and then they've perhaps watched a movie changing the soundtrack to the language, and they've involved a song, they've listened to a weather report, whatever they've been doing throughout the week with the language, they bring it together in a place at the end of the week where they use the language in a meaningful way. And that is how language is assessed, not just whether they've got the grammar or the syntax, but also whether they can put it together productively, usefully and meaningfully in one thing that makes sense to the student. So we build it up so that, for example, if the activity is, I'm going to create a way of showing a family around my hometown. I'm going to bring the family to all the sites that they're going to look at. I'm going to bring them to a restaurant. I'm going to ask them what it is that they like to do, what their hobbies are. And at the end of the week, I'm going to come together and show what that tour would be, with like a little map of where things are, a timetable of where I'm going to take them and when, and I'm going to talk it over in a video. That is the assessment of how they use the language, and that's the best way to assess language. I should say that Avenues Online has been developed in terms of the language component with some great and radical ideas by people like Will Lidwell in the R&D department, who is an out-of-the-box thinker like I've never known before, and Austin Volts. So when I'm saying these are the things that we do in Avenues Online, it's a whole team of people behind it. But it's been, I think the important thing to notice with Avenues Online, which is a strength for all the campuses, is that we've developed Avenues Online before this global crisis, and so it's based on best practices, and it hasn't been developed in a hurry. It's been developed with time to think about what would work in these circumstances, and all of the knowledge that we've gained through that program is available to all the campuses, and they're working with it. So I think that's important to point out with assessment too. Even though assessment might not have begun this way, this is how it's going.
Yeah, and an important part, as I said, of our mission is to share our discoveries, great and small, to advance education in the cause of education, as Ty knows. And so, to the extent that there are schools that we can help share some of our learnings, we want to learn with and from them as well. We're happy to do so. So maybe I think we have time for one more question. So. There is a question that came in about the possibility of parents turning into wanting to over control their kids during this time. So how can we construct this idea that education is not over controlling with the whole school community? So if you have advice for what parents maybe should do and shouldn't do, and maybe even a research to back it up on what parent surveillance, if you will, or could do to students learning, particularly in an online setting, that'd probably be helpful to our community.
So I think I've said my piece, which is that language learning relies so much on motivation and direct motivational currents, which is when the children see a point to what they're doing and they enjoy it. If you've been forced to do it by a parent, it's the motivation just won't be there. So I think it will be counterproductive. On the other hand, I wish these highly controlling parents would come to my house and take care of my kids because I think I go too far the other way. But I think that would be my piece for language. Choose your battles and don't make language one of them, because you don't want to give negative associations to language or learning to the child.
David or Ty,
Well,
go ahead.
I mean, I think. Go ahead, Doc.
Okay. I have a lot of sympathy for parents in this setting we're in right now, because their world has been turned over as well. Their home, they're now responsible for a big part of their children's education. They're not trained in how to do that, and some are discovering that it's a lot harder than they thought it might be, and very different than the way they learned when they were in school, and that's all disorienting. And whenever you're in a time of threat, you worry about your kids. And so I think that anxiety about, are the kids all right, is just going up and up and up for parents around the world. I think the one piece of advice that I would offer here, though, is that if you ever find yourself actually doing the work for your child, you've gone too far. And that's the place you want to back off from. Because, in fact, once the parents start to take over the tasks or the projects or whatever, it's not learning for the child, and that lesson, however it was constructed, is going to be ineffective. I heard somebody on television a few days ago talking about the fact that her child had a science project, and she finally conquered it at 11:30 at night. And I thought to myself, that's actually not such a great thing. I wish you hadn't. I wish you'd let the child figure that out, or got the teacher to help him with it. So that would be my one piece of advice.
I'll just add a PS to that, if I might, from the perspective of a college professor. When freshman students get into trouble, it's nearly always the ones, when you sit down and talk to them, the issue is that their parents have been very, very controlled about their work. They've suddenly gone to college and they're finding that they can't manage their deadlines and their assignments by themselves. Now, we usually work with them to help them do that, but it would save parents and kids a lot of trouble if they could get children used to being resilient earlier on. And I know I just said get children used to it. It's not something that you can give your child. But I'll just add to the wisdom of not doing the work for the child and not timetabling them too heavily, because you're kind of setting them up then for an issue in that very difficult first year at college.
Yeah. And if I could sort of maybe put a wrapper on this part of the conversation, which is I think we have to take a step back and maybe take a breath. And rather than looking to how do I manage and how do I give sort of adjusting feedback, I think you have to, I would suggest to parents and really to all adults that look for causes to celebrate, even if they're small gains. But the idea in these stressful times, focusing on reinforcers versus some sort of punishers is just, I think, a better and more fruitful plan. Because in the end of the day, as I think Ty and Jeff both started off the conversation, what happens in a particular hour block or a day block or a week block or month is all going to get washed out. But the idea that our children feel supported and nurtured in these sort of unsettled times, and even if they pretend like it's no big deal for them, it's unsettled. And so, again, my idea would be, in the grand scheme of things, at least at this period of time, many of these problems are little problems. So I would look for places to celebrate successes, even if they're little baby steps.
Yeah, and I would just add on, I think one of the things that our team has found is that now that students are getting a little more used to things and more oriented, we're starting to look for ways that we can do maybe study something or discover something that you wouldn't necessarily in class. And I would encourage parents to see, are there any opportunities that you can learn together as a family? Take a great course together, learn something new, having some of that social side of exploring some museums that you can right now online together, going to some Broadway shows that have been recorded, some of those type of things. Just discovering some different things together can be very enriching. And a way to be able to look back on this time that you are working at home and you are schooling at home, that it can be looked at as something that was joyous and a little different. And so the more that we can ignite the curiosity and discovery that is innate in all, figure out ways to propel that forward, I think we'll make this time look back with some fondness. So I appreciate everybody attending. We're at time for tonight. So I hope that these concepts of first principles can be informative to whether you are an educator looking to design and continue to iterate your program, a teacher who's doing it on their own, maybe for the first time in an online setting, or a parent or others to kind of understand more of some of the why of decisions that are being made in the design of programs. We look forward to continuing the conversation. I appreciate all the contributions that Ty and Allison and David have made to Avenues and me personally. And it was great to have a conversation with you and share it with hundreds of people around the world. So enjoy. Stay safe, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Bye-bye.